This passage here, the word of the Lord said actually there's going to be a drought, and he wanted Elijah to go, and so he's going to be a drought, but then he says actually I want you, there's not going to be any rain except my word. So you can imagine Elijah being a prophet. He's prepared all of those years, perhaps in prayer, hearing the word of the Lord, and ready to be used by God to see that Mount Carmel experience. We all want that, don't we? Maggie does, I know. She wants that Mount Carmel experience. I do. But what did he say? The first thing he said was, then the word of the Lord came to Elijah, leave here, turn eastward and hide. What? Hide at the Kerith ravine east of the Jordan. Don't you think it's amazing how this is a prophet of God who knows God personally, who wants to be used by God, but the first assignment from the Lord is, I want you to go and hide. It's amazing, isn't it? And I want you to go and hide in a ravine called Kerith, or Cherith in some translations. And I want you to go by the brook, and I'm going to provide for you water from the brook, and I'm going to command ravens to come and feed you. I don't know if anybody's ever been to the Tower of London. The ravens there are phenomenal, aren't they? They seem to have a conversation with humans. It's fantastic. But these ravens were bringing Elijah bread and meat in the morning and the evening. I don't know what this meat was. It couldn't have been very nice, could it? I'm trying to think that. You know what ravens are, pick anything. But it was that time at the brook he spent there. We'll look at that in a minute about dependence. It was then the word of the Lord came to Elijah, and he said, arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. See, I have commanded a widow there to provide for you. So not only is God commanded the ravens to provide for Elijah, he's also commanding a widow to provide for him as well. So he went to a place. Can you see him in the background there? I love that picture. I love it. It's brilliant. He went to a town, and then outside the gate, at the town gate, there was a widow gathering sticks. And he said to her, bring me a little water in a jar to drink. And as she was going to get it, he said, oh, by the way, can you bring me some bread as well? And she said this is a dire situation. She said, I don't have any bread. All I have is a little flour in jar and a little oil in a jug. And I'm just gathering a few sticks here so I can go and make a meal for me and my child, my son, so that we can then die. It's sad, isn't it? There was a drought as such that there was probably absolutely nothing to eat. And she had a tiny little bit left. Now I think we're going to be discussing that's a natural perspective on things, but Elijah had a heavenly perspective on things. We'll talk about that in a minute. Elijah said, do not be afraid. Go home and do exactly what you've said. Make a meal. First for me. I love that. Make it for me first. And then for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord of Israel says. I love this. The jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the Lord sends rain on the land. So she went, and then she made it, and she had food every day. This is 3 years, bear in mind, for Elijah, for a family, and it didn't run dry, in keeping with the word of the Lord. Isn't that amazing that when God says something, it will happen? That's another sermon. I should have perhaps preached on that instead. So sometime later, I'm just going through the story just to get it in your mind. We've read it, and then we'll go through it again, and then we'll touch on 3 points. Sometime later, her son became ill. And this really worried her, as it would do, but he ended up dying. It says his breath left him. And so she went down to Elijah and says, what have I to do with you, O man of God? Have you come here to bring my sins to remembrance and to kill my son? She's blaming Elijah for this. He said to her, so here is that heavenly perspective again. Give me your son. And then he cried out to the Lord, and he stretched himself out 3 times. It's very much like the other story about Elisha and the Shunammite woman, isn't it? It's very similar. And he said, Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him. And what happened? Life returned to the boy. So he carried him downstairs, and he says, look, your son lives. And the woman says this, now I know that you are a man of God. As if she didn't know that before. and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth. You see here all the things that he'd done and all the things he'd experienced through this man of God. She knew that he truly was from God. And I think that's really powerful for us as well, isn't it? So, okay, there's the story. So the first thing we can learn about this is, do you remember what it was? Dependence. Dependence upon God. Elijah here, there was a drought, so he was sent to a ravine. Now here, it was actually the brook was going to give him water every day. It's funny, isn't it? He gets a little trickle. He's not got a big torrent of river, but actually just a small brook. And he's drinking every day. And here, if you imagine, he's sent to just 2 people. I love that. Pastors want big ministries, don't they? I want a mega church. But Elijah had a congregation of 2 for 3 years. I love that. And that was God's mission for him. That was God's plan for him. And we know that the dependence, he only had some flour and oil, but then they had to trust that God would replenish that each day. Now, I would say this, God takes us to the brook in order for us to learn to be dependent upon him. He did it all throughout the Bible with different characters. Can you think? I'll name one. Joseph, 13 years, prison and all sorts. Can anybody think of any other characters who had to go through this process of being by the brook? It's all right, you're not going to get... Who? Moses, in the wilderness for 40 years. John the Baptist in the wilderness. Jesus himself was 40 days in the wood. Paul spent, some people say 3, some people say up to 7 years in Arabia, going back to his old place because they were looking to kill him. God uses this process of being by the brook in order that we have become dependent upon him. And sometimes you might say, actually, go and hide. And I think that's what our safe harbour is about in our vision, isn't it? Actually, God is now getting us and allowing us to be dependent upon him. He doesn't always give things in all big and abundance, although he does. But actually, he wants that for us to learn to be dependent on him, because he wants us to say, actually, I'm not capable of doing this, but you are a big God, well capable of providing for your people. I know Paul mentioned about C.S. Lewis a few weeks ago. I'm going to come back to C.S. Lewis now because I think this is great. Has anybody read the book Prince Caspian? Cecile has. This is it. C.S. Lewis, Prince Caspian, a child named Lucy. You know her. She's so cute in the film, isn't she? Bless her. She grows up so quick. A child named Lucy encounters Aslan, the Christ figure of the Narnia stories. After not seeing him for a while, she said, "Aslan, you're looking bigger." He said, that's because you're older, little one. And she said, not because you are. He says, I'm not. But every year you grow, you will find me bigger. Isn't that true for us? Every year that we grow in the Lord in dependence upon him, our God gets bigger. I mean, I would say this, I'm doing a degree in theology, and the more I learn, the more I don't know. And you find that, Nathan, right? It's true. When I first got saved, I knew everything. I was self-dependent. Yeah, I'm going to save everybody. But then the Lord said, no, that's my job. And thankfully he did that. So dependence upon God. Number 2. I love this. I don't know where I got this picture from, but I love the hat. I might get one of them. We need to see things from a heavenly perspective. See here, Elijah, there's a drought, isn't there? But he knew that there was a brook. Yeah? That would provide for him. He knew that there was ravens that were going to provide for him. The brook dried up. What happened? There was a widow with oil and flour. There was a jar and a jug with just a tiny bit in there, barely enough. But then there was enough for 3 years. See, he's thinking from a heavenly perspective. There was a dead child. Now, what would we say? That's it. Sorry. But Elijah said no. He cried out to the Lord, stretched himself over him 3 times, and life came back into that boy because he had a heavenly perspective. This is interesting. I think it was a guy called Chuck Missler who mentioned the fact that in science, scientists are now saying that there are 10 dimensions in this world. I don't know if there's any scientists in here. Please forgive me if I don't do this justice. But does anybody know how many dimensions we witness or we observe in our world? 3. That's right. There is 4, because time could be a dimension. But scientists are now saying there's actually 10 dimensions, and then we see, obviously, the angelic realm are operating in them, and we can't even see them. Let me explain why I think this is. Or actually, let me explain why I think this is. This is what Chuck Missler said, actually. If you imagine this cube, which is 3-dimensional, if there was somebody who was 2-dimensional on the paper, wanted to see that cube, when you put the cube through the paper, you can only see a square, which is 2-dimensional. So a 2-dimensional character can only see the square, not the cube. Does that make sense? So if I wanted to show a 2-dimensional figure on the paper, my finger, and I went like that through the paper, what do you think they would see? Just a circle. So if we are 3-dimensional beings, and yet there's 10 dimensions, think of all the stuff that we can't see that God knows about and sees. So this is what we're doing, is we're lifting ourselves not only out of the 2D paper into the 3-dimensional world, but we are lifting ourselves up into a 10-dimensional realm in which God knows all the things. I think Paul touched on this in Ephesians. He says, may have the power together with all the Lord's holy people to grasp how wide, how long, how high, how deep. There you go. That's a 3-dimensional world. So Elijah here, his relationship with God, he could see outside of his dimension and see what God was up to. So he was seeing things in the natural, or people were, but Elijah was seeing things from a heavenly perspective. That's quite powerful. I don't know if you ever imagine praying like that you're actually lifting yourself out of a natural realm to see things from a heavenly perspective. Try and do it, because actually we're so led by the natural, aren't we? And I know there's so many things that can take your mind off of that 10-dimensional space. So that's the first thing, is dependence upon God. The second thing is a heavenly perspective, and the third thing is faith. Does anybody think that's what faith looks like? You know, don't you, that most people preach that faith is a risk. Well, it is, in a sense, because what you're doing is you're saying, okay, I, through prayer, have a heavenly perspective on things. I can see what God's up to. But that isn't where we stop, is it? We have to say, okay, now I'm going to put that into action. So there was a drought, but the word of the Lord came, and then what did Elijah do? He went to the brook. The brook dried up, the word of the Lord came. So he went to the widow in Zarephath. The boy died, yet he had to go and stretch himself out 3 times. He didn't just say, oh yeah, that's going to happen. There was something that he had to do. It was actually, from his heavenly perspective, he had to put that in action, and that is what you had called faith. Later on, Elijah, the word of the Lord came to him, and it would rain again. But he had to go up to the top of the Mount of Carmel, get on his knees and cry out to the Lord in order for that rain to come. So the word came, that heavenly perspective, but he had to put that in action by getting on his knees and praying out to the Lord. And then we know Ahab ran off in his chariots. Bear in mind, they're on horses. And the power of the Lord came on Elijah. Now, what would have happened if it had stopped at that moment? Oh, I've got the power of the Lord upon me. Woohoo! He decided to run. And boy, he ran so fast that he outran these chariots and beat him to where he was going. I wonder if you've ever experienced that in your life. That's because his heavenly perspective he put into actions. And as we have talked about before, that Elijah was a human like us. He was in the natural like us. But yet he, through his relationship with God, had a heavenly perspective, learned to be dependent upon God, but put his faith into action. Now, we won't go on to Hebrews 11. We can see that by faith, they all required some sort of action on their part. Now, what does this have to do with mission? Okay, well, I'm just going to quickly close with these, or come into landing with these 3 points here. Firstly, just like Elijah, we need to rely on God, not self. So we should not be self-sufficient, but to be dependent upon relying on God. So when we're thinking about mission, it's not that we say, I'm going to go and do this today and these certain amount of people are going to get saved. It's, Lord, where do you want me to go? Who do you want me to speak to? Where is the widow that you want me to go and witness to? And it's being reliant on him. Jesus was a good example because it said he had to go to Samaria, as you explored in your life groups, to go to and witness to this one woman who was by the well. Philip was led to a eunuch, an Ethiopian eunuch, in which he then baptized him in the river. So it's being learned dependence upon God and not self-reliance, and listening to his voice. Now the second thing is, that's a brook. That's quite a lot of water, isn't it? So a world of drought and famine. This is what Elijah experienced. And I would say this, that today, people are in that same place today. I believe people are hungry, people are thirsty for something. And we know what that is. We know what that something is. That something is God. But we should develop an invitation culture that we want people to come to Christ, to say, look, come by the brook with us. Come and drink if you're thirsty. Come and have some food if you're hungry. I know we don't have any ravens here, but we have good cake bakers, I'm sure. Come to the light if you're in the darkness. If you experience death, come and you'll experience that life-giving life that Jesus says, come and you'll have life all in abundance and to its fullness. So we need to invite people to come to the brook. The third point is, which I've already touched on, we need help to help people see beyond the natural. This is, I suppose, where that prophetic comes in. Some people are so led by their feelings, so led by circumstances, so led by the natural realm around them. Sometimes they need someone in their life to come alongside them and say, actually, God has a purpose and a plan for you. I can see beyond what you're experiencing here. I can see that God is going to do something amazing in your life. And that's it, where you're bringing a heavenly perspective to someone's life. Actually, then we are then become encouragers, don't we? We're saying, yes, no, you're encouraging me. I want some of what you've got. I want to see this God who you've seen. It's going to be all right. We need to help people see beyond the natural. And then the last point is this. We've been by the brook, and sometimes it feels like the brook's dried up. But remember, when that brook dried up, the word of the Lord came to Elijah. And I would say to you this, what is God saying to you right now? Who is I put window here. Who is the widow? Who is the widow that God wants you, not the window. Who is the widow that God wants you to reach? Where is that light that you can bring in someone's darkness? You know, let's just have a time of quiet. Just for that moment, just to say, okay, Lord, let me be dependent upon you. Let me have a heavenly perspective. But let me have that faith where I can go and reach out into somebody's life. Who is the widow that God is asking you to reach out to? It doesn't necessarily have to be a person. It could be something. So let's just spend a moment in quiet, and then I'll close in prayer. And then perhaps someone can go and let Nikki know that we've finished. That would be great. It's just a moment in quiet. Father, we're so thankful for your word. We're so thankful, Lord, that Elijah, even though he probably wanted that Mount Carmel experience, Lord, you took him to the brook and you hid him for a while, Lord. And Lord, in that ravine, Lord, with nothing else around him but just a bit of water and some ravens, Lord, you allowed him to be dependent upon you. But Lord, there is going to be a moment where you say to us individually and corporately, now I want you to go. I want you to go. I've commanded a widow there to provide for you.